It's a real pleasure to be with my longtime friends and colleagues, Dr. Ben Jackson from the University of Western Australia in Perth, and Dr. James Dimmock, who is located in Townsville, Australia, at James Cook University. Together, they lead the Psychology of Active and Healthy Living group, where they coordinate research on a range of health, sport, and resilience-related topics. It's great to have the chance to speak with both of you guys today.
Thanks for having us, Les.
Yeah, same. Thanks, Les.
So maybe you can start, Ben, just by talking a little bit about the aim or the goal of the research group, the Paul group, as you referred to it. What is the sort of broad aim of your work?
Yeah, thanks, Les. We set the group up in about 2012, so 8 years or so ago now. And at that point, James and I had both been in what would, in North American terms, be referred to as faculty positions here for 4, 5, 6 years at UWA. And I think the reason that we set that up was first because we enjoyed working with each other, and that's really important to mention, is that we wanted the chance to do as much work together as we possibly could, and we still do. And we felt like we'd spent a bit of our early part of our career focusing on the bench end of the bench to bedside continuum, and doing observational or cross-sectional or experimental work that was informing our understanding of health processes, but wasn't giving us the opportunity necessarily to apply that and get it out into the community. And I think that was our real goal with setting up the PAL group, was to make sure that there was always that goal of taking what we'd done with our research and getting it out into the community as best we could. And so now when James and I talk about the group, the overall kind of vision or mission of what we do is to use the power of people, interpersonal support and connections, to promote any aspect of physical or mental health.
Yeah. And so when you say use the power of people, James, maybe you can expand or elaborate on how or in what way you use the power of people to promote healthy or active living.
Well, largely revolves around having people come together for the programming that we do, the community programming that we do. We incorporate, of course, other elements with our community programs, workshopping or some form of physical activity task. There'll be, I guess, issues within the programs that are aside from bringing people together, but at its core, it's bringing people together and establishing social connections. And what we found over the passage of time is that the formation of those social connections and the careful formation of those social connections is really the driving force behind good health outcomes. Yeah. I consider that issue to be much more powerful than any workshopping that we might do to try and help build resilience in people. I think the bringing people together angle and bringing the right people together is especially important in our efforts.
Right. So
yeah, spot on. Sorry to jump in if you don't mind me just adding on the back of that. JD and I talked in a pub in Perth last year. We did a lot of our talking while James was at UWA in the pub, but we actually were asked specifically to do a talk in a pub last year. And one of the things that we got at was the specific issue of finding the right kinds of support. And we see ourselves as playing an important role in trying to help people find that right kind of support. There are loads of examples from the top of my head. The ones that we talked about in that talk last year were things like the problems that mums have when they join mothers groups, where there's the show off in the group, and it just heightens those neuroses or paranoia, or joining a gym and it's full of lycra clad fit bodies that make us feel insecure. Those aren't necessarily the right kinds of people, even though people are around us there. Yeah. And there's that work on the social media paradox as well, that we're in 2020 more connected than ever to people, but also many of us feel more alone than ever as a result of the influences that we see on social media. So it's really about that issue that James mentions, getting the right kinds of support around people.
Yeah. So being intentional about how you create groupings of people sounds like it's important in the work that you do. And you mentioned the word resilience. So maybe either of you can talk a little bit more about. I know you've developed a program specifically for teachers, and I can say in the United States at the moment, there's a lot of teachers that are struggling, particularly trying to adjust to this online environment, and given the current circumstances, are struggling. So what, I guess my question would be, what does resilience mean? And what are some elements of the program that you developed for teachers in particular?
Well, we developed a program that we call GRIT, Growth and Resilience in Teachers, largely off the back of lots of evidence here in Australia showing that teachers suffer from high levels of attrition within the 5 or so years post-graduation from university, entering into the teaching profession. There's a really big churn in that industry, and that obviously it's got really detrimental outcomes for students and their learning. But of course, you know, the reason for the high churn, it seems, is that the teachers are under a lot of stress in this country, and probably in many other countries as well. So what we wanted to do is provide teachers with an opportunity to reflect on their mental health, reflect on their workplace. And bring teachers together to share experiences and to build coping skills together. So again, at our core in the GRIT program, our strategies to try and bring teachers together that might not have been brought together otherwise. And we try to consider who we bring together very carefully. And we found that the program works really, really well. We've got some really nice evidence to show that the bringing of those teachers together really helps the teachers feel a sense of connection and purpose in their workplace. And it improves their mental health, improves their sense of productivity in their job as well. So, you know, there are some other elements that we do. We go into the school. We typically spend a day in a workshop session within the school, talking about coping strategies that individuals might employ. They might consider, we give them a suite of options that they could employ at an individual level to help themselves cope with stressors in the workplace. But neither Ben nor I are presumptuous enough to think that that's going to change their worlds in a dramatic sense. I think the biggest influence is the fact that we try to impose a structure within the school. We work with the leadership group within the school to develop structures around connecting people over the longer term. So yeah, that's largely what the GRIT program is about.
And there's an emphasis, I think, in there as well, not just about, you know, trying to get across to people the benefits of receiving good forms of support, but also giving good support as well. And we often talk to teachers in those sessions about, well, look, you know, if you think you're coping well, don't disengage from this program. Actually see yourself as a bit of a pillar of strength in your school, and somebody who could pass on and share whatever it is about you that's helping you cope well. So we try to get that collaboration, I suppose, going in both directions. One thing that's maybe worth mentioning about the program, because it was a good lesson to us as researchers, is how it developed. We developed the program, and it's a lesson that we keep in mind in terms of what the community wants from us, not what we want to do on our, you know, with our CVs or with our research career. And so it actually came about through a conversation that James had with a teacher from the school that we first delivered the program into, and they said, we're struggling, we want help. We know you guys work to promote health in lots of different ways. What kinds of interventions or programs might you be able to consider for us? So we put together a bit of an offering of 5 or 6 different things. We said we could try and promote physical activity, or we could talk to you guys about sleep, not in the workplace, but, you know, nutrition, those sorts of things. And we pitched a few mental health ideas too. We could talk about emotional intelligence or whatever it might be. And the one thing that they really wanted was this idea, this piece around stress and resilience. So we went with that, and we let the program develop from there. And I think that's something that we keep at the core of PAL, is to do work for the community's benefit, not for our benefit.
Yeah. So it sounds like, when you're doing the research that then applies to the community, that you're really finding out what the stakeholders' needs or wants are, rather than applying your preconceived ideas.
Yeah.
You mentioned, Ben, go ahead, James, go ahead.
Yes, I've got a couple of points. One of the things that we've really taken to doing over the last 5 years as researchers is that exact approach, Les, which is, instead of developing a research idea in a lab ourselves and then going to an external stakeholder and asking whether they might be keen on partnering with us, we go there first. We go to the stakeholder first and ask them what they need in terms of, or might desire in terms of research in their workplace, or in terms of supporting the health of their workforce. And I think that approach has worked very well for us, because it automatically enables us to obtain strong buy-in from the stakeholder. And it also gives us an opportunity to learn what's important out in the community, not necessarily what's important in the lab, which might not have real-world relevance or impact.
Yeah.
And getting back to Ben's previous point about the involvement of teachers who are doing okay and might listen to our workshop and think, well, I know all this and I'm doing okay, I'm fine in my workplace. This is something that we've experienced in all of our programs. Actually, you get participants who are traveling reasonably well, and what we try to encourage them to do is encourage them away from thinking just about themselves. They really can be positive mentors and role models for others, and that brings back that issue of using those people in the right way as positive exemplars and learning from their coping methods. So instead of them tuning out to a workshop, maybe we can encourage them to think about how they can help others, helping them realize that others aren't necessarily in the same boat. That's where we feel our role is in those sorts of cases.
Right. So it sounds like you're trying to learn from those who are thriving, not just those who are experiencing distress or who are struggling to cope, but by learning from those who are coping well or have adaptive strategies. And then, as you mentioned, Ben, that those individuals get incorporated into the program to give support to others. Sounds like a valuable element of your program. One of the things also you mentioned earlier, James, is that when you were speaking to the people, or when they were congregating in groups, that it was an opportunity for them to gain connection and purpose. And I'm wondering if you felt like the teachers, or did they express that they were lacking some purpose or meaning to what they were doing? Was that evident in conversations, or?
A lot of teachers, certainly the ones that have been around for a long period of time, commonly say that they've lost that sense of drive, that sense of making a difference to kids. There's, I guess it might be a little bit of a symptom of burnout, perhaps, but disillusionment. We hear that a lot from teachers. The broader teaching community says that a lot, and we find it especially the case in the more experienced teachers, the ones that have been around a while.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's quite a common perception with teachers over here, at least.
Right.
I think one of the things that we've seen about what the program that we run and lots of other similar programs is, teachers are just under so much strain, even before the world went crazy with COVID. Teachers are just under so much pressure that just us being there and a program happening in their school that puts at the core of it their well-being and their happiness at work is something that they really appreciate. And we've seen, lots of feedback that there's a sense of appreciation for the leaders in the school for putting this on, so to speak, on the radar. And I think that sets things off on the right foot with programs.
So just the mere fact that you have an explicit program that's designed, or that's kind of got their well-being, or as you mentioned, Ben, their happiness as its kind of front and center or explicit aim, sounds like that in and of itself has value for the teachers.
It goes beyond. Go on, James.
One of the biggest benefits I think of the program is when we go back to the school 6 or so months after we deliver the workshop, is that the teachers often say to us that the workshop gave them the strength and conviction to go and talk more regularly with the leadership group, because they knew the leadership group recognized the mental health and resilience as an issue. Therefore, because they brought the program into the school in the first place. And so that recognition that the leaders were open and empathetic to this issue enabled them to then talk more freely with the leaders throughout that period. I think that's one of the best outcomes of our program.
Right. So would you say, oh, go ahead, Ben, sorry.
I think what's really important to mention is that issue, of it just starting conversations. When we go in with this program and with anything that we do really, we always try to make really explicit that we don't expect a miracle fix, or a change overnight. But we, over the long period, by changing the language, hopefully in these schools, and by changing a few of the support structures that might be there, then hopefully over the course of 6 months or a year or so, you can start to see positive change. So I think being realistic with it is something that they appreciate as well. They don't think that we're just going to come in and try and click our fingers and change things overnight.
Right. Was one of the concerns, I guess, or stressors that teachers experienced the fact that they didn't necessarily feel that they were being heard or understood by their leadership?
I absolutely, that's the case. In a lot of schools, a lot of teachers say that, a lot of teachers say that they just get swallowed by the workload, and they don't have a great relationship with the leadership group because they don't feel necessarily they have the time to go and see the leadership group. They don't feel oftentimes that their voices, when they do raise them, are heard very much. And so the school opening up for a full day workshop is real recognition, I think, that the leadership of the school sees mental health and resilience, coping as real issues that their staff are facing. And I think that really does improve the communication between staff members and the leadership group around those issues.
We ask for feedback about all the elements of that program and all the programs that we do. We're big enough and ugly enough to be told if we're not doing a good job, because we want to know and change that. But it's interesting that one of the things that we often see written down explicitly is that workshop days and conversations around these sorts of things are a chance for teachers to come up for air. And it's interesting what that implies about how they're feeling for 98% of the time, is that, they're kind of swamped.
Yeah. Ben, maybe you can talk a little bit more about some of the actual features or elements of the teacher resilience program.
Yeah, sure. Initially, we put the program together using a kind of persuasion or resistance to persuasion framework called inoculation theory, which is a long established psychological framework for helping people be resistant in the face of challenge or threat. Was originally developed off the back of the medical analogy that when people are getting vaccinated, they get a small dose of an offending virus inserted into the body, and then the cells in the body adapts and becomes resistant to stronger future attacks from that virus. And so inoculation theory in a psychological way works very similarly. We provide people with the kinds of things that may challenge or stress them and work on strategies to deal with those. Now, the way that a lot of inoculation work has been done in the past is lab-based with text, with messages that people sit and read. Here's something that might challenge an attitude and here's why it shouldn't. And what we wanted to do for our own sake and in terms of advancing the inoculation theory literature was to try and make that more interactive, make that more practical. And so we took those principles and applied them into the workshop that we put together. And then around that, we wrapped our key issue of good social support.
Yeah. So, I mean, imagine, of course, these teachers, you mentioned they're experiencing a lot of stressors. And so I guess you don't have to come up with too many hypotheticals to pose to them, but they're probably, you know, in communicating their stressors to you, do you then use those stressors as kind of a starting point for,
Yeah,
you know,
I'll pass it over to
inoculating them?
JD. Yeah, I'll pass over to JD because I'm sure you'll have some cool stuff to say about how we start the workshop. But yeah, that's exactly what happens, Les. But we try. We're not teachers, you know, as much as we teach here at the universities that we're in. We're not high school teachers, so we have to recognise that we're not in their shoes as much as we try to empathise. So we let them, you know, lead the discussion around the stresses and the most productive responses to those stresses, and we try to get conversation going in the school that way. But what we start the workshop with, which is again based largely out of inoculation theory principles, is some self-affirmation stuff, which we're doing some lab-based work on at the moment to better understand. So perhaps JD would want to talk a little bit to that.
Yeah, so we think, based on previous evidence, that it's really important for teachers and other community members, when they're in a position where they're quite stressed and they're finding things difficult to cope with, is to develop strategies to recognize the positive things that they do have. And in most cases, even when people are under high amounts of stress, there's usually a few things that are going reasonably well. It's very rarely the case that if you look at the whole gamut of a person's life, that there's nothing at all going well. And so, you know, for mental health benefits, we think it's a very important training maneuver to get people to reflect on what's positive in their life at that moment in time. And in relation to this particular program, we encourage them to think about why they entered the teaching profession in the first place, and what they continue to see as a positive aspect of their teaching profession. Very rarely will teachers draw a blank with this side of the program, which is really reassuring. I mean, the reality is there's lots of value in teachers, and most teachers do recognize their value when you ask them enough about it. But sometimes they lose focus on those positive aspects because they're consumed by the negativity that the stress of that particular profession gives them. But yeah, so we start out the program really talking to them, asking them about what they see as positive, why they entered the profession, why they found a sense of meaning in the profession, if not now, then in a previous time. And then we move gradually into a discussion of things that trigger them and trigger the stress, typically trigger their stress in the workplace, the identification of stressors in the workplace, and a reflection of the things that they try to use to cope. And they engage in discussions with each other around different coping strategies, and we talk about coping strategies, whether they're useful coping strategies or not. And so there's a lot of discussion and sharing of ideas around what may or may not be effective coping strategies. And again, this is where those people that may be inclined to be thinking, well, I don't need this workshop, I'm doing okay, I'm fine. This is where their value really comes out, is in sharing with perhaps the more junior teachers the methods that they've used to cope over the passage of time under certain circumstances. So we really draw from those guys in that moment.
Sorry, JD. One of the things that's probably worth mentioning there, Les, is something that seems to resonate with teachers in terms of the feedback that we get is drawing this distinction, which is from other people's work, not ours, of productive versus unproductive worry. Whether you're in control of the stress and the worry, or whether that stress and worry is in control of you. Yeah. And we draw the distinction there between getting people to focus on, well, what's a productive response look like for you, or for those in your school? How can we learn from others? And what's an unproductive response like, where that rumination and concern just seems to continue and doesn't go anywhere? And we've seen that often is something that seems to help people in terms of their approach to this sort of thing. You know, asking themselves, okay, am I being as productive as I could or should in this situation?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of, like, one of my former doctoral students was looking at this idea of growth after adversity, and he focused in particular on people who had traumatic injuries. and was looking at some distinctions again made by others that you allude to, Ben. One ideas of intrusive rumination, where you sort of have these uncontrolled or unbidden kind of repetitive thoughts of the trauma, and the other was termed deliberate rumination, where you're sort of deliberately, intentionally trying to make sense or make meaning out of the experience. And, in a number of studies, we found that latter, the deliberate rumination, seemed to be important in helping people eventually move past some of the trauma in a more productive way, shape, or form. Whereas the intrusive rumination, if that continued to persist, that eventually that became more debilitating or unhelpful. Sounds similar to what you're describing.
Sure, yeah.
So in terms of, I guess on that note, the coping strategies that some of the teachers articulate that are helpful or maybe less effective, what are some examples of some of the things that you hear or get when you have those discussions?
Almost without fail, when we talk about the productive or unproductive, alcohol comes in.
Yeah.
Numbing the pain. Some consider it productive, some consider it unproductive. It's what you'd expect in terms of the productive responses: communicating, sharing, seeking resources, looking for solutions, focusing on trying to deal with the problem, not just the emotions around it. It's those sorts of things that once we get teachers talking to each other, they tend to identify, I think.
Right.
The teachers that I've had one-on-one conversations with that have coped over the passage of time pretty well are the ones that are pretty expressive as well. They're not afraid to talk to others, including the leadership group. There still is in many circles some stigma around talking around mental health, especially to leadership group. And there's probably a degree of worry among some teachers of declaring that they're struggling to a leadership group. But the ones that we find typically cope well over the passage of time are less worried about that, and they don't see it as a problem addressing their concerns with leadership groups.
Yeah.
And of course, there's different ways of doing that, and there's different ways of talking to leadership groups about issues like that. But certainly communication with leadership groups, and a willingness to open up and express how people are feeling is key.
Yeah. So once they've had the opportunity in groups to express these maybe adaptive or more maladaptive coping strategies, is there some then effort to help them implement those strategies, or to kind of work through some of the stressors and to help them employ those coping strategies?
Yeah, so the final part of the workshop is what we call a resilience roadmap, which is where they determine how they're going to implement the strategies, the various strategies that have been introduced to them, including the connection with others. So we try to establish different mentorship aspects to the program, and we provide lots of different options for individual level coping as well. Some of those might resonate more than others, but the resilience roadmap is an opportunity for them to think about which ones might be most useful for them. We also do remind teachers not to be so hard on themselves, and I think that's also a pervasive problem in society beyond teachers as well. There's this growing body of literature now around self-compassion, just being kinder to ourselves, and treating ourselves as if we would treat a friend, and there's no way we'd talk to a friend in a school environment, a fellow teacher, in the way that we sometimes engage in self-dialogue, critical self-dialogue. And I think there's this really, among professionals, there's a tendency to have high expectations of oneself, overly high expectations of oneself, and too harsh a judgment on oneself. So we also talk a little bit around that literature of being self-compassionate, how we might be able to be more self-compassionate.
Yeah, there are a few of those things, Les, that they take time. I think lots of teachers, when they hear about them, they love the idea of, I can see that I probably could and should be a bit kinder to myself. Putting it into practice is trickier because it's changing, you know, in some cases lifelong habits. So it's about setting up a structure that where I think there's a focus on what you can do individually to try and change the way you think about these sorts of things, but also what the school can do structurally to help those conversations continue, to help those processes happen. And sometimes it's about the way that the teachers will communicate with each other, that the structure of group meetings and pods and those sorts of things that can help. Sometimes it's really, really simple stuff as well, though. Like one of the schools we went to said that we want a suggestion box, we want a comment or a feedback box put outside reception, so that if we're having a hard time, we can just dump something in there and we know it's going to be read. And attention is going to be paid to it, and hopefully action is going to be taken within this framework that the program provides.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about, you know, that distinction between the stressors and kind of on what level are they occurring? Are they more structural in nature or more individual? And I guess there's often the tendency to assume that, you know, when we think of stress and coping, we always focus on the individual, right? Like, how do we give the individual better strategies, assuming that somehow they're the ones that are in some ways flawed, or, you know, and if they just have better strategies or more robust, they'll be better able to cope or more resilient, when in fact, maybe it's the structure. You know, I, you know, was having that sort of discussion with my wife in terms of the schooling today, when my son was having some challenges with the online learning environment. And we sort of talked about this idea that, well, maybe it's not something specifically about how he's coping or failing to cope. And it's really the fact that they're maybe trying to squeeze sort of this brick and mortar learning environment into an online environment, and it just doesn't work. So maybe the issue is not the individual so much as the structure. So I think that's a great point.
Yeah, and we hear that time and time again from teachers. You know, they say, well, it's great what you're teaching us in terms of our ability to cope in the individual strategies, but the real problem lies at the sort of the leadership level, or even above, at the sort of the, you know, the broader school curriculum level in terms of workload. And
yeah,
all we can do is inform the leadership groups and the broader structure about those issues and what teachers are experiencing. We tell teachers that we will have conversations. And,
yeah.
you know, good.
Well, and it sounds again like if you're able, through part of this program in particular, to help improve lines of communication upwardly or sort of from the top coming down, that can address, you know, or maybe help meet some of the structural and individual level stressors that overlap with each other. I also thought it was interesting, you know, you mentioned self-compassion, and I guess teachers or others in achievement settings are notoriously hard on themselves. Maybe you can also speak to some misconceptions about the idea of self-compassion. I mean, I know that sometimes, like, if people think, well, you know, I shouldn't be too kind to myself because that's akin to going easy on myself or being complacent. And I guess, you know, maybe you can clarify sort of what self-compassion is, or how it might not be those things.
Yeah, purely anecdotally, but that seems to be the biggest barrier that people have to trying to become more self-compassionate, is that it's something for the hippies. You know, it suggests all of a sudden that we're going to be devoid of any ambition, or, you know, put ourselves in any kind of challenging situation, because we're just going to take it really easy on ourselves. And I think people are inherently wary of that kind of thing. But the way that we talk about it is the way that James talked about it there. You know, just trying to treat yourself a little more often how you would treat a really good friend. And I hope that helps break down that barrier a little bit. And it seems to make a lot of sense to people when you talk about it that way.
Yeah.
And I should say, it's not us who's come up with that approach. You know, that's a way that self-compassion is described in the literature, but we have found that that's a nice way of introducing and talking about the issue.
Yeah. And I mean, my understanding of the literature research is, you know, on some level, it also makes sense that if you think about just continually being hard on yourself or saying negative things to yourself, that not surprisingly, that may have some detrimental downstream effects or outcomes on people's health or well-being. And so, it sounds like there's also, I guess, when you clarify what the concept actually means, I don't know if that overcomes some barriers or helps people become more receptive to the idea or concept.
Yeah, to me, being self-compassionate isn't about walking through life just being happy screwing things up. It's, if and when we do screw things up, it's recognizing that that's happened, but trying to learn something from it at the same time, trying to recognize that we all screw up, and also trying to move past it and maintain some positivity, I guess, through it.
There was a meta-analysis done in 2012 on the effects of self-compassion on psychopathology, and there's pretty reasonably strong effect sizes, negative effect sizes. So the more self-compassionate people are, the less anxiety, stress, and depression that they suffer from. So there's lots of evidence out there to show that it's a very important quality to have, is to not be so critical on oneself. And as Ben said, that doesn't equate to not caring or being apathetic. It just relates to the more common issue of when one is overly critical of oneself, just being a bit kinder to one's reaction to oneself.
Yeah. And teachers are a smart bunch, and in terms of building the rationale for why we include a discussion of self-compassion in the program, we include that meta-analysis, and we talk to them, show them those results, and it seems to connect with those guys. They like to see the evidence that what we're talking about isn't just our approach and our theory.
Right. But there's certainly, an empirical base to support what you're doing and what you're saying. Yeah. I know you guys have a lot of other different programs. I'm also conscious of your time, but I love chatting with both of you, because I feel like, not only do I feel, I know you have such expertise in the areas that you've been prolific in studying and researching, and as you've talked about, bringing into community settings. So I just want to say thanks for your time, and I appreciate our conversation and chat. So thanks for taking the time to speak.
Thanks for the opportunity, Les. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure, Les. Always happy to chat, mate.